Greetings to everyone. I think all of us, no doubt, have been seeing preparations for Halloween this year. We've been seeing displays in department stores and grocery stores, and I just noticed a local Christian religious institution has set up large balloons of witches and ghosts again this year in front of their building. I remember as a child going door to door saying, "Trick or treat," and collecting all the candy I could on Halloween nights. I used to wonder, though, why my friends and I were doing this. And that was our parents that told us to, and after all, we were getting lots of candy, so what's not to like, right, if you're a child? But have we ever stopped to think about why we observe our traditions, such as Halloween? Now, many today, like I did, blindly follow the traditions that were handed down to them. They never stop to consider why they observe these traditions. For example, most people cannot tell us why they always have a cake with lit candles for someone on their birthday, or why it's so important to blow out all the candles on that cake. Well, we might not realize this, but our actions can be a form of communication to others. When we do something such as observe Halloween by our actions, we are implying that we approve of what we're doing. We actually endorse it by our support of it. But as Christians, one very important question we should ask is, do all of our traditions honor God? Now, some might say, well, if my friends, my pastor, even my parents observe a particular tradition, then it must be okay, right? By their participation in a given tradition, they endorse it as being good or even desirable. But can we always trust that what others are doing is always right? The prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 16, verse 19, tells us, he says, "Surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit." Jeremiah was right. We see this happening today. Many traditions have been handed down throughout the generations that really have no value, or worse, they may not honor God at all. Let's turn to Colossians chapter 2 and verse 6. That's Colossians chapter 2 and verse 6. Most of us probably never think about where our traditions have come from. More importantly, many really never consider if their traditions honor Christ, or if they might possibly even be an abomination to Him. But as Christians, or followers of Jesus Christ, we always want to follow Him and not the world. Again, that's Colossians chapter 2, verse 6. Here's what we read. He's talking to us. "As you have therefore received Christ, Jesus the Lord, so walk you in Him, rooted and built up in Him, and established in the faith, as you have been taught, abounding therein with thanksgiving. Beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." As Christians, we want to follow Jesus Christ and not the world. At this time of the year, many, including most Christians today, observe the tradition of Halloween. Why will so many Christians observe Halloween this year? And where did Halloween get its start? Is Halloween something that honors God? Is it just harmless fun? Or could it possibly be an abomination to God? We really need to know why we're doing what we're doing, and also what we're communicating to others by our actions. So today, let's take a look at Halloween. Let's look at its origins and how it's being observed today. Now, Halloween's origins date back to the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. Now, some may have heard this called Samhain, if I can pronounce it right, but Samhain is closer to the original name. That was how it was pronounced. Now, the ancient Celts celebrated a day they considered to be holy to their gods. Now, these were false gods, I might add. This was actually a day for them to celebrate the dead. They observed this day on October 31st each year. Now, the Celts' New Year began on November 1st. October 31st, the day before, was the last day of their year. The Celts believed that on the last day of the year, the world of the living and the world of the dead would intersect. Spirits of the dead would return. They would return to the earth and roam the countryside, playing pranks and making mischief for the living. Now, most believed it was too risky to venture out on a night like this. They would remain in their homes. They would set out things to eat to help the good dead along their way, and also to appease those evil spirits that roamed about. Now, those that did have to leave their homes on October 31st were, of course, very concerned about running into some of those evil spirits roaming the earth. To hide themselves in plain sight, you might say, and to avoid detection by these evil spirits, those ancient Celts would dress themselves as ghosts or evil spirits to blend in with them and move about in safety. They believed that the dead that walked about that night would not harm them or kidnap them if they appeared to be one of the dead themselves. Pretty good strategy. Now, the Druids, that was their religious leaders, also had large sacred bonfires, or as they were originally called, bonfires. Long ago, the people would get together to burn animals as sacrifices to the Celtic gods. This, they hoped, might also bring them protection from those roaming evil spirits. I can understand why they called them bonfires, because the bones of the animals were all that were left after being burned in those fires. But if we go back enough in time, we see that they sacrificed humans, particularly children, in these bonfires. From an article located at historyhit.com/What Are the Origins of Halloween, under the heading of Sacrifice, quote, "With newly uncovered archaeological evidence, historians are almost certain that animal, as well as human sacrifices, were made during Samhain to honor the dead and the Celtic gods. Crops were also burnt and bonfires were made as part of the worship of the Celtic deities. Some sources claim these fires were made to honor the ancestors, while others indicate that these fires were part of the deterrence of evil spirits." End quote. And as we've discussed before, the false religions of the Bible were mostly based on false sun gods. And many, if not most, of those false sun gods, like Molech, for example, required the sacrifice of young children by fire in these bonfires. We'll get to some of the other customs of Samhain and Halloween a little later. But is Halloween a commanded observance found in our Bibles today? That depends. If we read the Christian Bible, Halloween is never directly mentioned, although many of its customs are condemned. But according to the Satanic Bible, Halloween, or Samhain, is one of the 3 most important holy days for Satanists. When it comes to witchcraft, Samhain is number 1 on the list of Wiccan holy days. So Halloween is a very large part of witchcraft, of the Satanists' worship of their god. Turn next, if you will, to 2 Chronicles 33, verse 1. That's 2 Chronicles, chapter 33. We'll start in verse 1, 2 Chronicles 33. But surely the ancient Israelites never observed anything like this. They always followed that one true God, right? They would have never sacrificed children in bonfires or practiced any form of witchcraft, would they? When Hezekiah, king of Israel, died, his son Manasseh became king. Let's see what Manasseh did as king and if God was pleased by his actions. Again, that's 2 Chronicles chapter 33, beginning in verse 1. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, but did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, like unto the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. So Manasseh did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did things just like the heathen that God had already cast out because of their abominations to him. But what exactly did Manasseh do that so displeased God? Verse 3, let's see. For he built again the high places which Hezekiah his father had broken down. And he reared up altars for Balaam, and made groves, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. And he built altars in the house of the Lord, whereof the Lord had said, In Jerusalem shall my name be forever. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. Now, notice verse 6. If this seems to sound familiar, we'll just see what it says. Verse 6. And he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Here we see Manasseh sacrificing children in those bonfires we've been talking about. Let's continue in verse 6. What else did he do? Also, he observed times and used enchantments and used witchcraft and dealt with a familiar spirit and with wizards. He wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Let me read verse 6 again, this time in the International Standard Version. Verse 6 says, He burned his sons as an offering in the Ben Hinnom Valley, practiced fortune-telling, witchcraft, sorcery, and communicated with mediums and with separatists. Separatists here meaning wizards. Did a lot of things that the Lord considered to be evil, thus provoking him. So Manasseh burned his children in bonfires as sacrifices to the pagan god, just as the heathen had sacrificed their children to Molech and to other false gods. He also used fortune-tellers, witchcraft, magic, and communicated with those who claimed to speak with the dead and with wizards. Our Bibles tell us that these things were evil and that they made God angry. Skip down to verse 9. So Manasseh made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to err, meaning to go astray or to sin, and to do worse than the heathen whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. Wow. Manasseh was doing worse than the heathen around him were doing, the same ones God had chased out of, destroyed basically before they came in. So God was not pleased with what Manasseh had done. Again, our Bibles tell us that Manasseh was even worse than the heathen or the unbelievers, the ones that God had just destroyed. So God was not pleased. Now today, for Halloween, many have their own bonfires. Well, of course, we call them bonfires today. Does this behavior please God? What about carving pumpkins and placing them on our porches? Why do people carve scary faces into pumpkins and illuminate them, often with candles burning inside, then place them at the entrance to their homes? I'm sure we're familiar with this if we don't do it ourselves, right? But where did that come from? Well, one bit of folklore that might explain this is the legend of Stingy Jack. This goes back a long way. Stingy Jack is said to have tricked the devil into buying him a drink. He talked the devil into turning himself into a coin he could use to buy the drink. But then Jack prevented the devil from returning back to himself. Not sure how he did that. Eventually, he did allow the devil to become himself again. But there was even more trickery between Jack and the devil. Jack tricked the devil into climbing a tree and then put a cross on the trunk, preventing Satan from coming down out of the tree. At least that's what the legend says, okay? Well, look this up yourself for more details. That's the way it goes. But the bottom line was that after being tricked by Jack several times, the devil didn't want Jack in hell to spend eternity with him. Satan had enough of Jack, right? So when Jack died eventually, the devil denied him entrance into hell. But then neither would God allow him into heaven. Now remember, this was just a fable. It was a tradition. One that we know is not true. But since it self-explains some of the inherited customs of Halloween, let's continue with this. Now, Jack was unable to enter either heaven or hell when he died. He really had no choice but to roam the earth forever. Now, Jack had only a burning coal to light his way during the night. And he placed that piece of burning coal into a carved-out turnip to carry it. Guess it would have been difficult for Jack to carry that burning coal in his hands, so he used a carved-out turnip. Now later, people started referring to Jack as Jack of the Lantern. Jack of the Lantern. And this was, of course, shortened to Jack-o'-lantern. So that's where it came from. Now, people who were afraid of Jack, as well as the other evil spirits roaming the earth, or at least allegedly roaming the earth on October 31st, began to carve scary faces into turnips or potatoes. Now, eventually, pumpkins began to be used for this purpose. Today, many still carve scary faces into pumpkins and place a candle inside, then place them outside their dwellings. I suppose to keep Jack and all the other evil spirits away during the night of Halloween. You know, many make their own jack-o'-lanterns today. It's often a family activity. Of course, the legend of Jack of the Lantern is obviously not true. Yet, surprisingly, many follow the tradition of Jack even today, whether they realize it or not. But that is where the tradition of carving scary faces into pumpkins came from. Interesting. Now, the ancient Celts also believed that this night was good for telling one's future, their fortune. And it might make sense if we think about it. The last day of their year was when the world of the dead was so close. What better time to consult with the dead and ask those spirits about our future, at least as far as they believed. So fortune tellers would tell the people about their future. Seances were a popular tradition of Samhain. People would consult with mediums who would talk to the dead. Is this beginning to sound just a bit like what Manasseh was doing that provoked God to anger? But of course, there are many additional traditions observed during Halloween today, not just the ones we talked about. Well, it turns out around 43 A.D., the Romans had conquered most of the Celtic lands. The Romans themselves had a day that celebrated the dead, basically. It was the same as others were doing at the time. It was called Feralia. Of course, the two celebrations merged. But the Romans had their own traditions. For example, the Romans worshipped the goddess Pomona, among their many other false gods and goddesses. Now, Pomona was the goddess of fruit and of trees. The symbol of Pomona is the apple, a fruit. But don't forget that all the Roman goddesses were also considered to be fertility goddesses. So the Romans brought the tradition of bobbing for apples, or in some cases the apples were suspended from trees, not just in water, as you may have seen. The objective was to be the first to actually bite into that apple. That person was said to be the next one to marry and to have children, courtesy of the fertility goddess Pomona. We don't see or hear much about apple bobbing today, but if you watch some of the older movies or TV shows, you'll see this tradition pop up from time to time. But the Romans weren't the end of the outside influences, though. The Catholic celebration of All Martyrs' Day was established on May 13th, 609 A.D. Later, All Saints were added to All Martyrs' Day. This observance was then moved from May 13th to November 1st. Around the 9th century, Christianity had spread into all the Celtic lands. And around 1000 AD, the church declared November 1st to be All Souls' Day in honor of the dead. Are we noticing here how the church seems to be conforming to the world rather than having the world learn the ways of Jesus Christ? And guess what? On the evening preceding the 1st of November, All Saints' Day, they again had big bonfires and people dressed up as devils, etc. Sounds very familiar. All Saints' Day is also known as All Hallows' Day. The night before was known as All Hallows' Eve, and eventually, of course, as today, Halloween. That's a very brief historical overview of Samhain as it evolved into the Halloween we know today. But what about Halloween today? What do we know about that? Well, for one thing, its popularity just seems to keep increasing. Halloween is big business for retailers who vigorously promote it in the merchandise they sell at this time of year. I'm sure you've seen plenty of that running around. But check this out. From the National Retail Foundation, quote, this surprised me, by the way, quote, Halloween spending is expected to reach a record $13.1 billion this year, according to the National Retail Federation's annual consumer survey conducted by Prosper Insights and Analytics. The figure is up from $11.6 billion last year and exceeds the previous $12.2 billion record set in 2023. Even with concerns about price increases due to tariffs, Halloween continues to resonate with consumers of all ages, NRF Vice President of Industry and Consumer Insights, Catherine Cullen, said. Whether it's dressing in costumes or carving a pumpkin, more consumers plan to take part in Halloween activities and traditions. Retailers are prepared to ensure the shopping experience is a treat for consumers this Halloween season. Close quote. So more and more people are observing Halloween, and retailers, well, they're more than happy to accommodate them. And this might surprise you, but what exactly are retailers looking forward to this year for Halloween? What are they looking forward to? Again, according to the National Retail Association, consumers are expected to spend $700 million on greeting cards, $3.9 billion on candy. Doesn't surprise me. Halloween decorations, $4.2 billion. And Halloween costumes, $4.3 billion. That's why we see retailers really promoting Halloween in their stores. It's great for their bottom line. So that keeps it going. Lots of advertisements and things like that. But let's now look at some of the customs of our modern Halloween today. We're seeing things maybe from the past, such as jack-o'-lanterns, seances, fortune-telling, black cats, trick-or-treating, and mischievous behavior. Let's look at jack-o'-lanterns first. We talked about this earlier, but as we saw, Jack of the Lantern is a mythical character who roams the earth and a mischievous spirit at that. The jack-o'-lantern we see today was originally used in an attempt to scare Jack and the other evil spirits away on Halloween. But today, do we really believe that Jack and other evil spirits of the dead descend upon us every October 31st? Do we need protection from them? Will a scary-looking carved pumpkin really protect us by scaring all the evil spirits away? Well, first thing is, if we read our Bibles and study them, we know that the dead are dead. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 5 tells us that the dead know not anything. They simply sleep, as Jesus describes it. And they're not harassing people on October 31st or any other time of the year for that matter. They simply sleep, awaiting the resurrection. And second, if we're truly expecting a carved pumpkin to protect us in some way, isn't that relying on an idol and not on our Heavenly Father, as our Bibles tell us to do? And are we teaching our children to practice idolatry when we carve out these scary faces on pumpkins and place them on our porches? 1 John 5 verse 21 tells us, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." Amen. Now, I'm sure some people are probably saying, that's silly. Carving a pumpkin for Halloween night doesn't make it an idol. That's ridiculous, they say. But then my question is this. So what exactly is the purpose of this carved pumpkin, and why do we illuminate it outside our homes for all to see? I think that's a good question. Let's move on here. What about seances on Halloween? That's a popular thing. I've seen that. What about seances, or communicating with the dead as part of the observance of Halloween? We might recall that Saul did this very thing in 1 Samuel chapter 28, around verse 7 through the end of the chapter. Of course, so we recall, Saul had previously decreed that anyone involved in familiar spirits was to be put to death. Yet we find that Saul disguised himself, went to the witch of Endor, and asked for her to call up the dead Samuel. That would be what we would call having a seance today. So how does our God feel about consulting the dead or having a seance? Again, that's Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31. Regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek after wizards to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Contemporary English version reads, don't make yourselves disgusting to me by going to people who claim they can talk to the dead. God tells us that we should never approach those who claim they can talk to the dead. Those that do are disgusting to God. That's very simple. I don't believe that any of us want to ever appear disgusting to the God we love. I hope not. Let's turn to Leviticus chapter 20, one chapter over. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27. That's Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27. Now, we should never go to anyone who claims to be able to speak with the dead. Again, Christ tells us the dead sleep, the dead know not anything. Those that claim to talk to the dead are not talking to the dead as they contend. I can only see two possibilities for where their discussion with the dead is coming from. If you think of another one, let me know. But the first is that those claiming to talk to the dead might be just making the whole thing up. Maybe just fabricating the whole thing, maybe just to take our money. Second, and maybe even worse, these people are receiving communication from a spirit. This is likely an evil spirit. In other words, likely a demon. We should never go to anyone that claims, that is, to be able to speak with the dead. They just can't be trusted. They might be deceiving us, maybe to take our money, or they themselves might just be deceived. But regardless, we know that God really doesn't like it. Okay. Now, forgetting about us for a moment, what about those who actually claim to receive messages from the dead? How does God feel about them, the ones that claim this? Let's see in Leviticus 20, verse 27. It says, a man also or woman that has a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, their blood shall be upon them. Contemporary English version reads, if you claim to receive messages from the dead, you'll be put to death by stoning, just as you deserve. God clearly doesn't approve of anyone attempting to contact the dead. If one hears from the dead, it's not from a human that's died. Again, it's most likely a demonic spirit they're actually hearing from. What about fortune telling? Let's look at Deuteronomy 18 for this one. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10. That's Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 10. As far as fortune telling goes, and I was young, I actually attended a Halloween event hosted by my local Protestant church. Now, it turns out one of my relatives dressed up as a witch. That's true. Now, she had a little booth at this event where she used a crystal ball to tell people's future. Would God be pleased with this? Again, Deuteronomy 18, verse 10. There shall not be found among you anyone that makes his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, I can't say that word, or a wizard, or a necromancer. Well, what is necromancy? According to the Free Dictionary Online, the practice of necromancy is supposedly, I like the word supposedly they have here, supposedly communicating with the spirits of the dead in order to predict the future. So keep that in mind. Verse 12, back to the King James. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God does drive them out from before you. You, meaning us, shall be perfect with the Lord your God. Let me back up to verse 10 and read the Contemporary English version. Again, that's verse 10. It says, don't sacrifice your son or daughter, and don't try to use any kind of magic or witchcraft to tell fortunes, or to cast spells, or to talk with spirits of the dead. Our Bibles clearly tell us not to engage in fortune-telling or attempt to talk to the dead. But my relative was not really consulting with the dead. They were just acting. It was all in fun, right? So what's the problem? Well, don't forget that 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 22 tells us to abstain from all appearance of evil even. So, something to think about. Now, what about all those black cats we see on Halloween? They're all over various promotions, and they're part of many Halloween-themed displays. I'm sure you've seen that. And what about the traditional colors even of orange and black for Halloween? Well, according to an article in The Pioneer Woman, quote, as for black cats, the idea of being spooked by the felines actually has roots in the Middle Ages. Back then, many believed that witches avoided detection by turning themselves into black cats. Then there's the traditional Halloween colors of black and orange. Once again, these thematic hues date back to the Celtic festival of Samhain. For the Celts, black symbolized the death of summer, while orange represented the harvest season. End quote. Who would have thought that? What about trick-or-treating? What about parents telling their children to disguise themselves as ghosts or goblins or a cartoon character or something else? Then go to a stranger's home and say to them, trick or treat, implying that if they aren't given a treat, perhaps that person might just suffer a trick. In other words, some mischief might just befall them if they don't give someone a treat. Don't give them a treat. Now, I'm not trying to say that the parents actually intend to trick the homeowner, or that they put their children up to doing something like that. However, that they do teach their children to utter those words, trick or treat. Now, the meaning of those words is clear. Either you will give me a treat, or I'm going to play a trick on you. You probably won't like it. This is, of course, extortion, right? Okay. Now, again, many of you are probably saying, lighten up a bit, Alan. I don't teach my children to actually destroy property or threaten anybody. It's just good, clean fun. That's all. So why are you so upset about this, or why are you concerned? Well, let's turn next to Matthew, if you would. That's Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36. So again, another question I might have goes like this. Why do we teach our children to say trick or treat or even trunk or treat if we don't mean what we say? Then aren't these just idle words if we don't mean what we say? Well, again, Matthew 12, verse 36, and these are the words of Jesus Christ. Here's what he says. He says, but I say to you that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. For by your words you shall be justified, and by your words you shall be condemned. So whether we're serious or not, should we be teaching our children to say those words, trick or treat? And what if we teach our children to observe the other pagan traditions of Halloween? Is God pleased by this? We know in Jeremiah chapter 10 that God tells us not to follow the practices of the heathen. I think we all remember that. We won't bother to go there today, but turn next to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 2, right there near the beginning. So again, we're told not to follow the customs of the heathen. But what if we actually teach our children to follow these heathen traditions? Then what? Again, Matthew 18, verse 2. And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name, receives me. Now look very closely at verse 6. There's a but here. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. According to this, things won't go so well for whoever offends a child. It would be better if he were drowned in the depths of the sea. It's not that this person would be drowned in the depths of the sea. That would actually be a better fate than that of a person that offends a child. That's serious. Now, what does the word offend in verse 6 mean? Well, it's the Greek word 4625 in Strong's. It's scandalizo. The definition is to scandalize, to entrap, that is, trip up or entice to sin. Entice to sin. By teaching our children to follow the ways of the heathen instead of the ways of the true God, are we not enticing them to sin? God seems to have a very unpleasant punishment in store for those who entice, or we might say beguile, a little one to sin. That's kind of what Satan did to Eve in the garden, and we know his future is not going to be a good one. Let's turn over to Deuteronomy next, if you would. That's Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 29. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 29. What else does God have to say regarding following the traditions of those who worship false gods, who worship the gods of the heathen? Again, let's look at Deuteronomy 12, verse 29. When the Lord your God shall cut off the nations from before you, where you go to possess them, and you succeed them, and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself, that you be not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before you, and that you inquire not after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. You shall not do so unto the Lord your God, for every abomination to the Lord which he hates have they done to their gods, for even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. You shall not add thereto, nor diminish from it. Halloween is certainly not commanded in our Bibles. It's certainly something we've added to. And Halloween is also known as a night of mischief. Especially when I was younger, I saw quite a bit of mischief on Halloween night. In my part of the country, at least, people would often cut down trees and block roads as pranks. But then what about people who might have a medical emergency and need to get to the hospital? So these pranks weren't necessarily all harmless. Now, from the website, blogs.loc.gov, under the label pranking, quote, playing pranks often varies by region, but the pre-Halloween tradition known as Devil's Night is credited to a different origin depending on the source. Some say that pranks started as part of May Day celebrations, but Samhain, and eventually All Souls Day, also included good-natured mischief. I might add that the mischief was not always good-natured. Okay, continuing on, it says, when Irish and Scottish immigrants came to America, they brought with them the tradition of celebrating Mischief Night as part of Halloween. So that may be where that came from. But let's turn next to Proverbs, if you would. Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 1. That's Proverbs chapter 24. We'll begin in verse 1. Now, we still continue to see pranks on Halloween, often resulting in inconvenience or even property damage. Sometimes they need to clean up the mess left behind anyway. But should we or our children be a part of a night where mischief abounds? Again, Proverbs 24, verse 1. Be not envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them. That's pretty important. For their heart studies destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. Right down to verse 8. Verse 8. He that devises to do evil shall be called a mischievous person. The thought of foolishness is sin, and the scorner is an abomination to men. Do we even want to be associated with those who might cause mischief or trouble on this night? I wouldn't think so, but let's turn over next to 1 Thessalonians. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 5. Easy to remember. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 5. As we read our Bibles, many, many times Jesus tells his disciples that we are children of the light. we are not of darkness. And Paul mentions this here in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 5. So let's take a look. He says, you, and that's us he's talking to, you are all the children of light and the children of the day, and are not of the night nor of darkness. Again, we're told repeatedly in our Bibles that we're children of the light and not of darkness. But you know, I really can't think of a more dark day than Halloween. So are we indeed children of the light, observing God's declared holy days during the light time of the year? Or are we the children of darkness? Does our holy day season begin as the season of darkness begins, starting, of course, with the darkest holiday of them all? Let's turn to 2 Peter 2, verse 1 next, if you would. 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. One thing that kind of surprises me, maybe shocks me, is I know that pastors today are very well aware of these things, yet many continue to insist on perpetuating these abominations to God. Now, it might seem incredible to many of us. I mean, surely our pastors today would never lead anyone into sin, right? Of course not, would they? Again, 2 Peter 2, verse 1. I'd like to read the next 3 verses using the easy-to-read version of the Bible. It says, in the past, there were false prophets among God's people. It's the same now. You will have some false teachers in your group. They will teach things that are wrong, ideas that will cause people to be lost. And they will teach in a way that will be hard for you to see that they're wrong. They will even refuse to follow the master who bought their freedom, and so they will quickly destroy themselves. Many people who follow them in the morally wrong things start over again, verse 2. Many people will follow them in the morally wrong things they do, and because of them, others will say bad things about the way of truth we follow. Well, they do. They think we're crazy, right? It's just plain fun. Well, you know, so many churches today sponsor trunk or treat. They can call it anything they want, but it's simply changing the name. Does that hide the fact that this is basically a Halloween observance? Well, it doesn't hide it from us, and it certainly doesn't hide it from God. I checked a local church's website about their observance of Halloween in the form of trunk or treat they're hosting again this year. How do they justify observing the occult? How do they justify participating in this? Let me read you a direct quote from their Facebook page. Here's what they said. Quote, we're so glad to have this opportunity to show love to our surrounding communities. Close quote. Are they truly showing love to the people in their communities by participating in Halloween, regardless of what they call it? And while the second of the greatest commandments is to love each other, the first, our greatest commandment, is to love our God. Participating in the practices of Halloween does not show our love for God, but rather provokes him to anger. We saw that. So what would motivate a pastor to teach anything other than the Word of God as found in the Holy Bible? And particularly something that God says angers him. Well, here's one explanation, possibly verse 3. 2 Peter 2, verse 3. These false teachers only want your money, so they will use you by telling you things that are not true. But the judgment against these false teachers has been ready for a long time. They will not escape God, who will destroy them. Now, I need to tell you that the word destroy them here in 2 Peter 2, verse 3 is not translated very well. It should be translated as they'll be held for judgment. Judgment in the last day. Now, I wouldn't want to be one of them, because if you recall, James 3, verse 1, International Standard Version, reminds us, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more severely than others. Wouldn't want to be one of them. Let's wrap this up. When I grew up, I celebrated Halloween. I went trick-or-treating myself. I didn't know any better. Most people don't. It's not their fault, really. They're not bad people. They're just deceived. Would Jesus Christ go trick-or-treating? Would he carve scary faces into pumpkins and place them outside his home? Would he consult with mediums and fortune tellers? Would he participate in mischief on Halloween night? Would Jesus Christ participate in any part of this satanic tradition? I'd say absolutely not. And of course, neither should we. Not if we're truly walking in the light of Jesus Christ. I'd like to end today with 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 20 and 21. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 20 and 21. When it comes to celebrating Halloween, at the very beginning of the dark season, do we want to honor devils, or do we want to stand steadfast for the Lord? Again, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20. Here's some more good advice from the Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians 10:20. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. Brethren, we are true followers of Jesus Christ. We simply cannot compromise with darkness. We cannot drink from the cup of devils and at the same time the cup of the Lord. So let us always stand fast for truth. Let us always drink of the Lord's cup. Let us no longer walk in darkness. Let's reject what is not true and what comes from the satanically inspired traditions of men. Rather, let's all walk in the light of our great Savior, Jesus Christ.